Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode, we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I am Matt. I'm here with my new friend, James. James and I met during my last in-person training, which has been my only in-person training for a long stretch of time. And, it was just one of those people that I connected with during the break that I knew our conversation needed to go on. And so we connected a week or so afterwards. And then it's like, I'm not done with this guy. I want to learn more. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. I want to talk about some of the great work you're doing with this amazing circles that you're doing. I don't even think I could do it justice to begin to explain it. So why don't we start out just to introduce yourself a little bit more formally to our audience.
Thank you, Matt. And likewise, honored and grateful to be here with you. So I've been working with men and women who engage in violence in interfamiliar relationship. And for a number of years, and actually, due to the magic of Zoom, I'm going to be opening up some groups, Spanish-speaking groups in Kansas. And, we're here. Yeah. So we're here in Colorado, and I can,
Yes.
be in the space with them through Zoom. And so there's obviously a tremendous need for the Spanish-speaking community to begin to address some of these issues of interfamily violence. So that's one of the things. But in terms of the circles, it's something I'm trying to develop, Matthew, and it's I think this why we're having this conversation is how do you engage in transforming, healing and transforming people's lives, right? And through your own personal experience, like our own personal stories. As you know, I wrote a book called Wheeling to Healing. And really what I addressed in that is the ACEs piece, which really kind of lit up the world for us in a way,
Absolutely.
right? And so I think that piece of asking people instead of what's wrong with you, what happened to you, which I see in every man or woman that I work with, the way that their childhoods impacted how they engage in the world as adults and why they have developed coping mechanisms that are not necessarily beneficial to them or anyone else, right? And then how do we help them to find other ways of being?
Yeah. Well, and what you speak of too, as someone who's done a little bit of work in intimate partner violence, and I'll own that I've only sort of been in the orbit of that I haven't been really engaged in that arena for probably about 5-7 years. So my knowledge isn't as cutting edge as it once was, but let me say the next statement, and I'd love to just get your sort of opinion on it. Is one of the things that I found when I was doing the work was it was really, for understandable reasons, really easy in some ways for professionals in the intimate partner violence arena to say, we need to take care of the victim, so to speak. I don't like the word victim all that well, but just for efficiency's sake, that the person impacted that had experienced the violence, that the violence was inflicted on them, maybe is a better word. I also saw it was very hard to ask what happened to the person inflicting the abuse and the pain. And I just I want to just throw that statement out there and get sort of your experience, because if it's hard to ask what happened to somebody, I think in the intimate partner violence scenario, as well as child abuse. I mean, there's some other ones as well, but when we talk about people with physical strength or some sort of power, using that power to inflict pain and trauma, it's hard to step back and say, oh, let's apply the paradigm to them as well.
That's a great question, Matthew, which I've been really exploring for, I'd say, the past 10 years and probably most of my life, because I grew up in domestic violence, right? And my first experience with it, I was 3 years old, and I woke up to screaming and made my way outside, and my mother and father were outside on the lawn, rolling over each other and hitting each other. And all I remember is screaming. It's all I could do at that age, which eventually got their attention and they stopped. And but so it was a series of those experiences that shaped my life. And later on, at the latter part of my life, I'm 63, but in my 50s, I had been a teacher and I left the classroom because I became an activist. And in my 50s, I went through this process, Socratic process at the Aspen Fellowship.
And brag on that experience a little bit. You shared that a little bit.
Well, what that did for me is I read the allegory of Plato's cave, and these individuals who live in the shadows, and some of them make it out to the light, right? And in that process, see that there's this whole other world beyond the shadows. And what that did for me is made me want to understand that better, and then also at some point make my way back into the cave, as many do. We learn certain things that we can't keep to ourselves, right? That there's other ways of being. So I'm straying away from the question, but I think what you initially asked me is there's a propensity to see, especially because it can lead to lethality, right? People can get killed.
Yeah.
That there's got to be a way to limit the violence. And we go to the easy solution, which is we'll just stop them. We'll either put them in prison or we'll put them in these groups, and they'll acknowledge that what they did is bad and that they won't do it again, right? But we haven't found that to be really that effective in terms of the way that I've been working, and this is with an organization in Kansas, that the Family Peace Initiative is helping these men to understand why they do what they do, right? And rather than what's wrong with them, what happened to them, back to that question of what happened to them, and taking them through their childhood with the understanding, this is data driven, that 2 out of 3 of us, or 2 out of 4 of us who grow up in domestic violence end up perpetrating it, right? So we learn a certain way of being. And so this other approach that I want to get to is more helping these men understand why they do what they do, and that doesn't create a safe world for themselves or anyone else, and then giving them the tools to be able to be safe themselves.
Yeah.
And if they're able to be safe, then others in their surroundings are going to feel safe. And really a big piece of that is the adverse childhood experience. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I just, because I think you bring up a really powerful point, and honestly, what I've struggled with to put into words, because on one hand, we know that hurt people, yet one of the things I struggle with as far as language is not every hurt person hurts people. So it's I try to, on one hand, when we talk about what happened to you, and knowing that people that have grown up in violence often then continue that cycle, so to speak, if cycle's the right word, yet not everybody does it. And I wonder, sort of in your experience, have you found any variables that, knowing that, like you said, either 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5, but maybe if we just say 50% for lack of a specific percentage, end up inflicting violence, have you seen any reason what leads someone to be violent in their own life versus someone who might not have that as part of their struggles with their trauma. They may have other struggles if they don't get treatment and help. But do you see when you sit with the folks that you're trying to help, do any commonalities at all rise up to the surface, either in your work or research or both?
I mean, I don't think there's enough data for me to answer that within the world of
That's been
domestic
my frustration.
violence, right? But there is the data in terms of, we studied prisons more than we've studied, domestic violence programs. And what we do know is that 85% of the men who are in prison, especially people of color, have been abused as children,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that there's that commonality within the groups that I work with. Most of them have been through a tremendous amount of abuse. And so helping them to understand how that has then, my teacher, Richard Rohr from the Living School, talks about it in this way, that whatever you don't transform, you transmit.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that we do in my work with the Family Peace Initiative is we talk about cruelty. And we define cruelty as the blatant disregard of another, right? So there's obviously the part we focus on, which is the physical abuse. But there's all kinds of different types of abuse, Matthew. Like, in my world, in my life, I married, sadly, my marriage didn't last. We were married for 17 years, but my ex-wife and I, at some point, as we were repairing the damage, we have a daughter together. We sat down and I asked her one day why she left me. And what she said to me, just the awareness of lack of awareness on my part, actually, because what she said to me was, I had to get up in the morning and when the first 5 or 10 minutes of the day, see how you were doing in order to see how my day was going to be. Right? That type of oppression that you can inflict on someone. And I had my line, Matthew, because of what I saw as a child. I wouldn't go there physically.
Yeah.
Right? I drew a line in terms of physically harming my partner, but I went there verbally. I went there emotionally. So there's other ways. And when we have that conversation, where there are men who don't hit their wives, but there are also men who become workaholics, right? Who develop addictions, gambling and alcohol, and who are not available, right? Or there are men who just don't know how to make themselves emotionally available to another person. So again, when you put it in that context of cruelty as the blatant disregard of another human being, and if we want to end that, because it's as you know, generational.
Yeah.
Right. As many of these forms of violence in our lives are generational. We experience them. I was one of those men. I'll never be like my father.
Yeah.
And I became just like my father, right? I didn't know any other way to be. So that's why this piece for me, the ACEs study, was just like mind-blowing, because it gave my life context. Like I shared with you in our previous conversations, I feel fortunate to be alive.
Yeah.
I've done so many things to put my life at risk. And so the fact that I'm here and not even just fortunate to be alive on a physical level, but and part of what we wanted to talk about is the spiritual, the emotional, the mental state of being able to be in a place where I wasn't for the first 50 years of my life, which is there's a solace. And within that solace, there's also these incredible moments of wonder and awe, because I'm no longer just surviving.
Yeah.
Right? I'm now aware of my environment, and I'm able to see things that were just not available to me. You can talk much more about this than I can, but even in the neurobiological
Mhm.
perspective of it. If I'm not in my prefrontal cortex, if I'm not able to make sense of what is happening, then I'm just experiencing it and not able to integrate it. And I'm not saying it right, but help me
Well,
out.
actually, you're saying it perfect. It's that integration. And one of the things where I think we connected as well is that idea of and you mentioned in your intro, the personal narrative or the story of yourself and how trauma, if we don't get treatment, whatever treatment looks like for the individual, that the trauma is still happening. That I think is really, even as a trauma survivor myself, I had to really go back into my experience because I was lucky enough to get treatment and have I still got cracks back there, but have had a decade or so of healing and post-traumatic growth, and the privilege that I was so fortunate to get into treatment earlier in my life. And but that it when you're still experiencing the trauma and however that manifests, and for the folks that we're talking about, in violence is how it's manifesting, because like you said, you haven't really integrated what happened to you into the story of yourself and your life and the world. And so it just dominates that. And who am I is a question that, what a privilege for those of us who have got to sit and kind of think about that, to be in a state where we're safe enough, we're in a place where we can really be that reflective. Because that to me just kind of brings me back in having empathy is still happening to folks. And again, if I don't have a framework for that integration, it's going to continue to dominate me and lead to outcomes that we don't want for anybody. And again, with the folks you're working with, can really inflict harm and take that trauma to the next generation and continue that cycle of violence. So yeah, I think your words actually is exactly what we talk about in trauma treatment.
Yeah, and what you bring out for me, Matthew, is the possibilities, right? Like the hope of men like myself who are able to go through that transformation and then maybe encourage others or impact others to do likewise. And I mean, this is just, we're talking about domestic violence, but this is in all our systems, right? I'm working now with the tiny home villages. These are little, which is how I met you, right? Like people who have been living on riverbanks and in alleyways are now getting their own little tiny home where they have a roof over their head, but they face tremendous amount of trauma in their lives, and even to that point of being unseen, right? They're walking about our midst as though they didn't even exist. And so we recently started these drumming circles at one of the villages, and I was part of that, and I've been sharing this story. There was somebody who joined, but she didn't sit in the circle for a number of reasons. She was a little bit outside of the circle, but she still was participating. And she didn't have a drum, but she had a percussion instrument. And the person who was leading the drumming acknowledged her because at some point she took her little percussion instrument, tossed it up in the air and caught it. And so he pointed that out. And when we all looked at her, it was just, she lit up.
Awesome. Yeah.
Right? She was just like seen. She was seen.
Yes.
Right? And then when we finished, she got up from where she was and she came closer into the circle.
Mm.
And that's one of those moments, Matthew, that when I talk about wonder and awe, it all came together for me. There is like, she's now safe enough to be in communion with us.
Yeah.
And it's not just about me, and it's not about every individual drummer, but we all need to do it together. It was a communal, collective experience that I think leads into this bigger conversation of, some other words that to describe this in terms of, and I think religion is the only thing we have that takes us there, is something greater than ourselves
Yeah.
that points out that interconnectedness.
Well, and I love that. I love that example too, because of the, and I, we connect over our shared nerdism for this stuff as well. But it's like, a way for the individual that you were talking about in the drum circle to probably self-regulate enough, like, and to have that safety, and then the community to welcome someone into the circle where they may have not felt welcome in a circle ever. I mean, knowing all my work in homelessness, has that person ever felt comfortable? And for me, as someone who's trained as a cognitive behavioral talk therapist, if you would have tried to talk her into that circle, probably would have been wasting your breath. Maybe a really well-trained therapist could do it, but just the power of the regulation and the connection through, in this case, music. Just a powerful example with that. And to follow up on your last point, we talked about when we connected, sort of the role of spirit in your own journey. I wonder, how do you, because I think spirituality, and I've really struggled with this from both as I love talking about spirituality, and I feel comfortable bringing it up, but I really, one of the things with trauma healing is, and I kind of have a joke, but it's true, when I get to meet someone, especially my work in homelessness, because sort of in their darkest moments, you talk about addiction, you talk about living out on the street, you've got a lot of things weighing down. And these people, a lot of times when I meet them, they've at least, made a kind of a 180 and then a step or two forward, because now they're presenting, and they're doing some maybe peer advocacy work, those kind of things. And I always ask, what happened? What happened? You shared with us, you were living on the street, struggling with an addiction, you lost all hope. And usually it's something like, I met a good outreach worker and found Jesus. Like, and my joke is, well, if you're in Boulder, Colorado, it might be Krishna. I don't get caught up specifically like, Jesus, but it's a connection with another human being, and a reconnection with spirit. And it's not 100% that's the answer, but it's in the 90 percentile for sure. And so I wonder, as I know somebody's thought a lot about spirituality in your own journey, how do you bring that in to your work?
Alice Miller, and you're familiar with her book, Drama, the Gifted Child, she talked about this term, enlightened witnesses, right? These people that see you. And that can change your whole life, being seen, right? And I think we all have the ability to do that. So without getting into a discussion about religion and spirituality, this thing that exists, this ability that we have because we're relational beings, and we actually need each other to self-regulate, to start tapping into that within ourselves, right? That inner journey that connects you with that part of yourself, that inner resource, that, again, I put a name to it. I call it God. Yeah. You can call it many different things, but just something other than yourself, something greater than yourself, that brings you into the possibility of getting into communion with another. And so having been somebody who's grown up in the violence that I experienced, I spent most of my life, as I said, very self-involved, right? Because that's how I learned to survive. It was one of the coping mechanisms that kept me going, that got me here. But at some point it didn't work anymore. And as I started evolving, I read, I think I shared with you, and it's in my book, I put a knife to my father's throat at 26. And when I called my mother right after the incident, she said, just come home to me, right? And I went. And I stayed there for a couple of weeks. In my family, there's a lot of readers and there's a lot of books, and on the bookshelf was M. Scott Peck's, I don't know who was reading it, The Road Less Traveled. And what I read in there, Matthew, was you can't love anyone until you love yourself. And that's been a 30-some, I'm in my 60s, so 30, 40-year journey. And I still don't do it well, right? I still don't do it well. But that opened me up to, once I started giving myself the ability to value myself, to have a sense of worth, a sense of value, I was then am at the point where I can help others. Yeah. I can witness others, right? And from a different place than the way that we do it, which is I'm not stepping in to fix you.
Yeah.
Right? I'm stepping in to be with you, to be present. And just like that, I mean, that somatic experience of the drumming, it wasn't any big thing. It was just, we just came into community. We had some fun.
Yeah.
And it opened up a door, right? And that's the other, and I think that's where the spirituality piece is. I'm now aware of the doors that open, where I can step through and maybe see you or be seen by you and be available. Is this too woo-woo or?
No, because we need, one of my goals is to just create spaces to talk about spirituality. It's funny, and I may have shared this with you too, is I don't consider myself an expert on spirituality. I mean, I've read books, I've studied, but for me, if you're gonna do a workshop, you better at least know your stuff. So I always partner with somebody when I do it, and the last few times it's been this great physician friend, Dr. Deborah Bourne, who's been on the podcast a few times with me, and I love it, and we've done this at the National Healthcare for the Homeless conference, and it's standing room only, and I barely have, as the presenter, like I literally had someone sitting on my feet. And they were mushroomed outside the door, and I think Deb and I can put on a pretty good show. So we would draw a fairly decent crowd, but I'm not even, maybe we'd fill all the seats. I don't know if someone would sit right underneath me while I present to hear me talk on other topics, because I think we're very spiritual people, at least a lot of us in this field. There's an exercise I get to do if I have a good extended like self-care training is, what brings you to this work? And about, I'd say 1 out of 3 answers that question has something to do with spirituality. So if that's why you're here, I have this joke with leadership. Hey, if God tells your folks they need to be working in this field, there's some motivation. You got something to work with in that arena. And, and I think it's not a joke, because it happens over and over again. I'm sitting across from a PhD or an MD or somebody with a much greater degree than I have, and we're having a kind of a professional conversation. And then after the first glass of wine, we're talking about your ayahuasca experience in Peruvian jungle last year. Like, so we have this incredibly deep sense of spirituality amongst us. And we haven't even found a way to talk to ourselves about it. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right on. And I think to create safe places where we don't bring judgment that, hey, if you don't believe in my spirituality, you're going to hell. I think a lot of us really struggle with that, concept, because a lot of us have, I wouldn't woo-woo. I think we can all make fun of ourselves for that, but we've thought deeply about this. We've kind of gone behind what my preacher or my priest tells me to something very deeper, because a lot of us come with our own trauma, as well. So I think when we don't talk about this and we don't bring this up, whether it's through a drum circle, whether it's through discussions in groups, we do a disservice to folks for sure.
Yeah, and I was really drawn when you shared that with me, that when you do have those groups, it's standing room only,
Yeah,
right? There's a hunger.
yeah,
And right now, as we explore the issues, the polarization that
yeah,
we're facing as a nation, the Black Lives Matter
yeah,
movement, there's a hunger to go beyond something that we've been confined by, like these walls that have separated us, even religion, right? Like that they've taken Jesus, and I was raised Catholic and considered a Christian, but the idea that he's your personal Messiah that is going to save you from this
yeah,
other place that you're going to go to if you acknowledge your sins and live a certain type of life, versus an individual who came here to do what we were talking about previously, to witness us,
yeah,
to see the leper, to see the guy on the side of the road, to see the prostitute,
yeah,
and to say to them, you're more than that.
yeah,
You're
yeah,
more than that, right? Brian Stevens says, you're not the worst thing. He works with men on death row. You're not the worst thing you've ever done,
yeah,
right? And I don't know your politics, and I don't want to get into politics, but we have this now, the Trumpers versus the never Trumpers, but they're both human beings, right? They're both people with soul and heart, and and so why can't we do that for them, right? We can understand that, yeah, this guy who killed somebody is more than just that moment,
hmm,
but why can't we come together? And that's where I think the hunger
yeah,
is for us to come together to have those conversations of how we are more alike than we are different, how we not even alike, but we are interconnected,
yeah,
that Ubuntu, right?
yeah. Yeah, so let me ask you this question, because one of the things with spirituality that I've also, and again, it's been a topic of this. One of the more controversial episodes, I think, is had to, and that means it's good from my perspective. If it got people thinking, but but so, and I wonder how you handle this, because on one hand, there is the positive with that. I think both you and I have experienced in our point of this journey of, I try to connect with spirit every day, and that brings a lot of energy that, it kind of gives me armor in some ways to go in and talk and think about trauma and keep myself healthy. Like I said, I almost think I put my spiritual, psychological armor on to do this work each day, because I want to leave with some energy to be a great husband, as well as to give a 3-hour Zoom on trauma, the most depressing topic you can come up with. Spirituality also, though, I know for a lot of people, or their maybe religion is a better term to use, but their experience is one of twofold. One is, and again, we both share, being raised Catholic. The Catholic Church, which has done a lot of good throughout history, at least the American, when you look at that, you look at what happened, with the child abuse scandal. The word evil could be parts of that. Again, I'm not judging the whole, but there was a lot of evilness in that. So and I talked to folks from the Mormon faith who disowned. I talked to somebody who grew up in Scientology, and very, very similar to experience. So there's also both religious trauma that I think people just connect to their spirituality. And there's also the shame, and I wonder more so, I'd love to hear both of thoughts on both of these, but also, I imagine as you talk to folks who have inflicted trauma on other people, where does overcoming shame play into that, especially as we talk about spirituality?
I guess I would approach it from the idea of redemption,
Mm.
right? From the last thing that Jesus, and I don't know the last time, I want to put words in his mouth, but when he was
Hey, you
up
want to be
there,
the first, my friend?
right. But when he was up there nailed up to the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, right? And for men like myself, who for most of my life didn't know what I was doing because I wasn't even conscious of what I was doing in terms of not that not again, this is difficult because it doesn't mean that I am escaping accountability. I've done a lot of harm, right? But I was living in that survival mode where what I was doing was how I learned to get through what I had to get through. And so approaching it from there, and I guess getting to this place this is a difficult, painful conversation to have. Religion has hurt us in many ways, right? It's done a lot of good and it's done a lot of bad. But that liminal space between darkness and light that we can exist in, and it takes courage to go there. Like one of the things that I now feel like I understand is necessary is for us to go. Steve Haley, who created it with his wife Dorothy, the Family Peace Initiative, have created this model called the River of Cruelty.
Yeah.
Right, which takes us down this river of these adverse experiences that we've had, these cruelties imposed on us. We then transmit it. And when we were having these cruelties done to us, we had these adverse feelings, which we don't want to feel, right? We spend our life, like with myself, with alcohol or other ways to numb the pain. But the numbing, those coping mechanisms aren't beneficial to us, right? They have consequences that are not, the DUIs I've had in my life, et cetera, right? But there's that shift, which is a painful shift, is to have to look at that, which you don't want to see,
right,
and acknowledge it because it has informed you. But then once you made that shift, there's also this other piece, which I think is the essence of religion, is the being witnessed. Somebody, Matthew, I believe, loved you. Somebody, if you're fortunate, most of us are fortunate enough that somebody saw you. Somebody saw you other than that other message that you got, right? From my father and my mother, I got the message that I had no worth, that I had no value. My grandmother, Raquel, gave me the message that I had tremendous value, that she loved me unconditionally.
Yeah.
And there's been many people in my life as I've gone down that river. And so that piece of it, I think that's what religion in its most effective way, I think it's what Jesus came to. You are more than what you are more than what you are showing me or what I am seeing, right? And if we can give that to people, if we can go down that conversation, because it needs to be a collective experience. When I've gone through this process with individuals, there's a sharing of things that they've never shared with anyone, and in that there's a vulnerability. And what that vulnerability does is it just makes us feel closer to them. And so there's this deep connection. And the reason I wanted to have this conversation with you is then what I found, it doesn't work through the workshops and the trainings, because then people go back to where they came from, right? And all of that is gone, right? So my question is, and which is what religion I think was meant to do, is it brings us close together. It takes us to this other level of community, right? We call it communion, right? And ideally that we find a way to sustain that. And I haven't figured that out yet. It's like, but I know that we need it at this point. We need to, I'll stop.
Yeah, and I mean, I do a lot of thinking and have done a lot of thinking because of COVID, and just knowing that a lot of folks I've worked with throughout the years are just all have been in survival mode now too. And it's just like, it's always been a part of my, leadership training, but also my self-care as well as, it's your organizational, it's your team culture that holds so much of the collective stress. And it's like, I think, we are so big about providing empathy, providing compassion, but that, when you said those words, it also just makes me think about, I always like to use the language, at least, is our the dynamics, the support, the community we create with each other as a team, as a staff, supervisors and staff, that collective, which is often called in the business literature organizational culture. Really, what comes out of that is the climate that our clients, patients, participants, students really feel, whether they meet us as an outreach worker on the street or whether they walk in to our health center. And I know when folks get stressed, there's this interesting human dynamic is initially we reach out for others. We want to be co-regulated. And if that fails, then we often then pull back and isolate. And, that's why, again, I think that what's going to stick with me, one of the things through this conversation is that drum circle example is, somebody who's probably reached out or been taught when you reached out, you get hurt. And then through drumming and through acceptance, being able to take the huge risk, which may not be a risk for me or you, but I imagine never meeting this individual, or at least not thinking I have, was a tremendous risk to have that level of vulnerability, to even physically be part of that group. And that's, so I think when we talk about community, whether it's a tiny home, a village that we're trying to create a community amongst the residents there, or it's us as staff and trying to create our community of healers and helpers. If we don't focus something on that, I feel we get lost in this work, or, and so many people gotten lost because trauma for a lot of folks makes you feel different. Something's different about you. And knowing that now that, when I was an adolescent, that probably most of my friends have gone through similar things that I went through, but we didn't have the ability to talk about it. It was just like, there's something wrong with me. And as long as that, I carried that, I found different ways to reinforce that in my life. And it was like, part of my healing was like I said, I didn't have the language at the time, but something happened. And that allowed me to look at myself as kind of a work in progress and not have to be perfect all the time, which was, a huge relief in so many ways.
Yeah, I love your energy, Matthew. It feeds me. It feeds me, brother. I would say, like, what came up as you were talking is this. I always felt like when I was a teacher, nobody takes care of teachers.
Oh no.
Right? And
systematic,
right.
as my listeners know, with a first grade teacher life. Amen. I'll just say, yes, they don't.
But we need to, right?
Oh,
because if they're not safe, I mean, that's where this intersection of whether it's domestic violence, whether it's education, whether any of these, like, what are we going to do with all the nurses, all the first responders, and what they've gone through, right? Because there is going to be a tremendous amount of post-traumatic stress, and and they need now, that they're going to need our love, our support, right? And we need to start thinking in that. I mean, that's the biggest thing in this conversation is like, how do we create these spaces where people feel held and loved? And from that understanding that that's what we were given.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not that, it's incredibly complex, not complicated, complex, but it's that simple.
Yeah.
It's like for me, what I struggle with now is I'm still trying to do things. I'm still trying to enter the space and have all the stuff prepared and teach these lessons and give these strategies and skills. And not that that's not important, right? But if I'm not present,
right,
it's meaningless on some level. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And, it's that I think we need to voice and own that compassion and empathy are incredibly exhausting. And, I don't think we ever say that. They are. Now they're incredibly rewarding, as the fact we get to get up each and every day and do this work is such a privilege. to have, and yet both the empathy, compassion, and also repressing our normal emotional reactions to things. Like, we treat our clients, our patients, we communicate differently. You listen to me talk about motivational interviewing. It's their journey, right? If we tell them what to do, which, in a friendship, it's different boundaries. We might often tell people what we really think. We have to suppress all that. And I think we've been like, we don't give enough voice to that. We don't take care of the educators, the healers, the helpers in a way that allows us to have a healthy workforce and yet get good results, because our outcomes are based on the quality of relationships we're able to really establish. And I think until we start to prioritize that, we're going to be always feeling like that we're coming up short in many ways. And I think that's hopefully coming out of COVID, a focus on self-care, because we have to recover, like you said. We'll have long-term conversations about this, because to hear somebody, to be empathetic, to be present is pretty much the most exhausting thing you can do all day long. Like, and everybody listening to this knows you may not have gotten your steps in, but when you sit down at the end of the day, you feel like you've run a marathon. And I think that demonstrates how exhausting that can be.
Yeah, and I wanna leave you with two stories, Matthew. That
Perfect.
One is in this art of facilitation that we do at the Family Peace Initiative that I've been through a number of times. I was sitting before I started being one of the trainers. I was sitting in a group. I think there were 20 of us, and there was this woman, because a lot of different people go through this process, and she was from the prison industry, a guard, and she was annoying the hell out of me. Like, she was one of these people I focused on because she was so resistant to everything. She was just guarded, right? That's so fascinating, right? A guard who's guarded. She just had so many walls around her. And then we did this exercise where you sit in one chair and your father is in the other chair.
Oh, the empty chair.
The empty chair, right? And she went through that, and it was like painful, but also beautiful to experience that journey with her as she really talked about the lack of love, the lack of nurturing, the lack of support that she got, that made her who now, who I'd been seeing, right? This person who had learned how to survive by being the toughest guard on that block.
Yeah.
The guard that everybody feared, right? And through that, through that process of getting to actually see her, it changed her and it changed me.
Yeah.
Right. It's not one way, right? It was reciprocal. And I remember going up to her at the end of the 2 days and asking her if I could give her a hug. And that hug was more for me than for her, right? But so there's that's one piece of it, of as we get to know each other beyond the barriers. And then the other one is at the end of my life, I went to care for my father at the end of his life. And there was a point where he couldn't bathe himself anymore. And so I would bathe him and, soap him down and dry him off. And there was this one day when I was doing that, we were in the bathroom and I was drying his feet, and I just overwhelmed with this feeling of wonder and awe and grace.
Yeah.
And we were not two separate men. We were one with each other, and there was something else in that room. And it was no different. And this is what is really fascinating. When I dropped that knife, Matthew, a light came through that window, and I had that same feeling in my darkest moment as I had in that bathroom. So being able to hold both, right? The suffering and the light. And part of it is going to the suffering, which we have not been, we got so many self-help books and, so many ways to feel good and happy. And we just are not But I think we're there. I think that's where I'm at, is like, what I'm seeing is this is a great time for us to be here having this conversation.
I would back that up 100%, my friend. Well, James, with the couple minutes we have left, we'll put, as everybody knows, traumainformedlens.org. We'll put some information, definitely how to get a hold of your book, but also you as well. But maybe for the listener, do you have a website? How would they find out more about you?
It's wheelingtohealing.com. And if they want to reach me personally, info@jamesencinas.com.
Beautiful. Well, my friend, I knew I was going to enjoy this conversation. We will find a topic to bring you back on, because I know everybody will benefit from your wisdom. And I thank you so much for sharing that with me and our listeners. So
Thank you,
until
Matthew.
next time, my friend, we will pick up this conversation at some future point.
Look forward to it. Blessings, brother.